Good evening. Hi, I'm Kay Gabriel. I work here at the Poetry Project. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It is an honor to celebrate the full translation into English of Peter Weiss's The Aesthetics of Resistance, Weiss's magnum opus, and to welcome Joel Scott, the translator of volumes 2 and 3 to the Poetry Project. Some logistics before we begin. Bathrooms are upstairs. There is an accessible restroom in that room behind us. Let me or my colleagues know if you need the key to get in there. We'll be happy to let you in. The run of show tonight, I'm also pleased to welcome two friends who have also, like Joel and probably Joel the most of us, but like me and like some other of you have been transformed by this book. I'm really excited to have Adi Blaustein-Reto and Sebastian Larcon here tonight to read this amazing book with us. And thanks as well to the Center for the Humanities at CUNY for generously supporting this event and helping us fly Joel across the Atlantic. Set in Europe from 1937 to 1945, Weiss's three-part, 1,000-page novel follows the trajectory of people working across the broad ideological spectrum of the left to overturn that era's fascist regimes. Every character in the novel, except the fictionalized Weiss-adjacent protagonist and his parents, actually lived and fought this war. Many of them died in the process, and Weiss pays particular attention to their efforts and sacrifices, asking what they made possible for others to understand and do in a period of extraordinary coercion and suppression. As they make their way across the continent and conditions deteriorate under their feet, they think together as much about their present as about works of art, to work through their complexity together and see what sense this process of interpretation can make out of histories of frustrated uprising. It is almost unbelievable, but not quite, that the final volume has landed in our laps in the middle of this nightmare. I'm sure all of us are extraordinarily grateful to Joel for spending the past 8 years or more finishing the translation into English. I'll also say that reading this book together with Patrick Dida, who ran last night's discussion at CUNY, felt like learning to think for the first time. And I really mean that. One of tonight's themes is the reading group and the infrastructure of the reading group as, let's say, to learn collective cognition and action. It's a left-wing technology. We have it for a reason. This book encourages us and maybe requires us to use it. And in that sense, the readings are derive in part from me and Sebas and Adi as being people who are not Weiss experts and just people who were really transformed by reading this book together with our friends and learning to think about it. So I'm so glad that we get to talk about it together tonight. I'm looking forward to thinking intentionally, deliberately, and in comradely ways with all of you, using the patterns that this book makes possible for us. And I also want to draw our attention to this extraordinary painting that Adi has made. It's called The Book Club. You can talk about it a little when you get up here. I think it illustrates pretty spectacularly some of those themes that I mentioned just now. Okay, the run of show for tonight. Adi, Sebas, and I will read short passages in that order. Joel will read for as long as he likes. And then we're all going to talk about the book relatively briefly. And maybe we'll have a Q&A if we have the appetite for it. And I think that's everything. And so I'll just get started. Please, I didn't bring your bios to the stage, so I'm not going to read them. I can't even remember if I collected them. Please welcome Adi Blaustein-Reto.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Just not much to say about the painting. It's, about kind of the intensity of the book, but inside the joy that happens when you come together with a learning community, or that specific learning community. But I'm going to read a section from the beginning of Volume 1, where our narrator is with his first iteration of the reading group, or his reading group, with his two friends. The cornice was the ground for the warriors. From its narrow, even strip, they threw themselves up into the turmoil. The hooves of the horses banged upon the cornice, the hems of the garments grazed it, and the serpentine legs twisted across it. The ground was perforated at only one place. Here, the demoness of the earth rose up, her face hacked away under her eye sockets, her breasts massive in a thin covering, the torn-off clump of one hand lifted in a search, the other hand asking for a standstill, loomed from the stone edge, and knotty, long-jointed fingers stretched up from the profiled corbel as if they were still underground and were trying to reach the wrist of the open, thumbless female hand. They moved along under the cornice, seeking the blurred traces of incised script, and Copy's face, his myopic eyes behind glasses with a thin steel frame, approached the letters, which Heilmann deciphered with the help of a book he had brought along. Copy turned toward him, attentive with a broad, sharply drawn mouth, a large protruding nose, and we gave the opponents in this melee their names, and, in the torrent of noises, discussed the causes of the fight. Heilmann, the 15-year-old who rejected any uncertainty, who tolerated no undocumented interpretation, but occasionally also adhered to the poetic demand for a conscious deregulation of the senses, who wanted to be a scientist and a seer, he, whom we nicknamed our Rimbaud, explained to us, who were already about 20 years old and who had been out of school for 4 years by now and were familiar with the world of labor and also with unemployment, while Copy had spent a year in prison for circulating subversive literature. Heilmann explained to us the meaning of this dance round, in which the entire host of deities led by Zeus were striding toward victory over a race of giants and fabulous creatures. The giants, the sons of the lamenting Gaia, who in front of whose torso we were now standing, had blasphemously mutinied against the gods, but other struggles that had passed across the kingdom of Pergamon were concealed under this depiction. The regents in the dynasty of the Attalids had ordered their master sculptors to translate the swift transience, paid for with thousands of lives to a level of timeless permanence, thereby putting up a monument to their own grandeur and immortality. The subjugation of the Gallic tribes invading from the north had turned into a triumph of aristocratic purity over wild and base forces, and the chisels and mallets of the stone carvers and their assistants had displayed a picture of incontestable order to make the subjects bow in awe. Historic events appeared in mythical disguise, enormously palpable, arousing terror, admiration, yet not understandable as man-made, but endurable only as a more than personal power that wanted, enthralled, enslaved people galore, though people at the top who dictated destinies with a mere stirring of the finger, the populace, when trudging on solemn days, scarcely dared to glance up at the effigy of its own history, while, along with the priests, the philosophers and poets, the artists from elsewhere, all full of factual knowledge, had long since walked around the temple, and that which, for the ignorant, lay in magical darkness was, for the informed, a handicraft to be soberly assessed. The initiates, the specialists, talked about art, praising the harmony of movement, the coordination of gestures. The other, however, who were not even familiar with the concepts of cultured, stared furtively into the gaping maws, felt the swoop of the paw in their own flesh. The work gave pleasure to the privileged. The others sensed the segregation under a draconian law of hierarchy. However, a few sculptures, said Heilmann, did not have to be extracted from their symbolism. The falling man, the man of Gaul taking his own life, showed the immediate tragedy of a concrete situation. But these sculptures, replied Copy, had not been outside. They had remained among the trophies in the throne rooms purely in order to indicate from whom the shields and helmets, the bundles of swords and spears had been taken. The sole aim of the wars was to safeguard the territories of the kings. The gods, confronted with the spirits of the earth, kept the notion of certain power relationships alive. A frieze filled with anonymous soldiers who, as tools of the higher-ups, fought for years attacking other anonymous soldiers, would have altered the attitude toward those who served, boosting their position. The kings, not the warriors, won the victories, and the victors could be like the gods, while the losers were despised by the gods. The privileged knew that the gods did not exist, for they, the privileged, who donned the masks of the gods, knew themselves. So they were even more insistent on being surrounded with splendor and dignity. Art served to give their rank, their authority, the appearance of the supernatural. They could permit no skepticism about their perfection. Heilmann's bright face, with its regular features, bushy eyebrows, and high forehead, had turned to the demoness of the earth. She had brought forth Uranus, the sky, Pontus, the sea, and all mountains. She had given birth to the giants, the titans, the cyclops, and the furies. This was our race. We evaluated the history of the earthly beings. We looked up at her again, the demoness stretching out of the ground. The waves of loosened hair flowed about her. On her shoulder she carried a bowl of pomegranates. Foliage and grapevines twirled at the back of her neck. The start of the lips, begging for mercy, was discernible in the raw facial plane, which veered sideways and upward. A gash gaped from her chin to her larynx. Alcyonius, her favorite son, slanted away from her while dropping to his knees. The stump of his left hand groped toward her. She was still touching his left foot, which dangled from his stretched and shattered leg. His thighs, abdomen, belly, and chest were all tensing in convulsions. The pain of death radiated from the small wound inflicted between his ribs by the venomous reptile. The wide, unfurled wings of the kingfisher, growing from his shoulders, slowed down his plunge. The silhouette of the burst-off face above him, with the hard line of the neck of the hair, which was tied up and tucked under the helmet smoke of the pitilessness of Athena. As she swung forward, her wide-belted cloak flew back. The downward glide of the garment revealed, on her left breast, the scale armor of the small, bloated face of Medusa. The round shield, her arm thrust into its thong, pulled her along to new deeds. Nike, leaping up with mighty wings and loose, airy tunics, held the wreath invisible and implied by the gesture over her head. Heilmann pointed at the dissolving goddess of the night, Nyx, who with a love was hurling her vessel full of serpents toward a downcast creature, at Zeus, who in his open, billowing cloak was using his woolen aegis, the goatskin of doom, to whip down 3 adversaries, and at Eos, the goddess of dawn, who was riding like a cloud in front of the rising team of the naked sun god, Helios. Thus he said, a new day dawns after the dreadful butchery, and now the glass-covered room became noisy, with the scraping feet on the smooth floor, with the ticking echoes of shoe soles on the steep steps leading up to the reconstructed western facade of the temple to the colonnades of the interior court. We turned back toward the relief, which throughout its bands demonstrated the instant when the tremendous change was about to take place, the moment when the concentrated strength portends to the ineluctable consequence.
Thank you so much. Our next reader is Sebas Alarcon.
Hello, I'm Sebas. I'm going to read a passage where our narrator in the book, I think in 1937, is going on a walk with this character from the book, Willy Munzenberg, who's talking about his coming up in the party as a youth. Willy Munzenberg was a real person. He was a communist, a friend of Lenin's, helped found the Communist International, and ran what the back of the book calls a communist publishing empire, where they published books, journals, newspapers, films. And it's unclear, but in 1940, it seems like he might have been a victim of the Stalinist terror. But that's a little bit before then. It starts, there were always, he said, 2 apparently contradictory forces working within us, one demanding patience, discipline, the other spurring on radicalism. constructive, the other raging against rigid relations. And then it turned out that these were just two sides of the same coin, and that both had to be accommodated if we wanted to realize our full potential. Ibsen, Strindberg, they would almost have elicited our expulsion from the workers' union, for in the eyes of some functionaries, such literature promoted moral decay. They considered the reading of realist, socially critical novels and plays more dangerous than the scientific instructions for social transformation found in our nascent studies of Marx. The name of the progenitor was not yet frowned upon within the party, but in the depictions of the downfall of bourgeois institutions, particularly the old guard social democrats sensed a danger that also seemed to threaten their own organizational apparatus. The fear of a ruthless analysis of human coexistence, which inevitably led to animosity toward art and literature, this impulse that was always confined to the unconscious, immediately denied when put up for debate, continued to cling to the workers' movement as a petit bourgeois reactionary hangover that was responsible for its tendency to make compromises, its narrow-mindedness, and dogmatism. In our to break the old educational ideals, in our effort to find a new form of life, we came across those who demanded that the coming revolution be total, that the entire human being be seized by it, from the impulses of dreams through to practical actions. In 1912, we had caught wind of these signs of cultural upheaval, and we immediately incorporated them into our political onslaught. That which 4 years later was so emphatically expressed at Cabaret Voltaire by those who had fled the orgy of mass murder, we soaked up in its first inklings. Living surrounded by international newspapers and periodicals, by flyers and manifestos, emissaries traveling to and fro, we had absorbed the creations of the likes of Crevan, Picabia, Duchamp, Arp, and Apollinaire. Nobody knew where we had developed the openness for such experimentation. The explanation was perhaps simply once more that our senses had been sharpened by all the humiliations and castigations. I hate assaults, wanton violence, punch-ups, he cried. And yet we belong to the generation that arrived at scientific thinking through misery and poverty, through a constant attempt to escape from figures of authority through homelessness and vagrancy. I don't want to glorify that in any way. There are better ways to gain a sense for recognizing connections, but we were taught this insight through violence and terror. The new came, as always, from Paris. In an age when capital was preparing the most enormous episode of plunder and barbarism ever seen, we dogged, haggard, former messenger boys who were supposed to be made into wolves found our way to the idea of fraternity, to a celebration, the kind that had often rung out here in the city, in the midst of the most brutal brawl. With these words, he came to a standstill, swung his arms wide open, standing in the Parc d'Exposition, behind the Porte de Versailles, where the suburb of Vanves began. The gray of his eyes was of an almost blinding brightness. With his stocky figure, his high brow, dark hair, he resembled Hodan. In their mannerisms of speech and gesture, their affinity was even more prominent. Münzenberg had founded another periodical. He was always longing for such a mouthpiece. In 1914, he said, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, when we made a stand against the Social Democrats' support for the war, we were the party. All of the youth associations were dissolved by the geriatric leadership due to their anti-military stance. There was one revolutionary stream approaching us from the Russian underground with its political charge, and from Paris, the current of the artistic revolution. The two collided above us in Zurich, but not in order to numb us, but rather to exculpate us, to deliver us into clarity. In September of 1914, said Münzenberg, I stood next to Lenin for the first time. Radek and Bukharin had already arrived in Switzerland a few weeks earlier. while the Austrians still had Lenin interned in Krakow. At the end of the month, Trotsky arrived in Zurich. When I think about that time, he said, about the monstrous supremacy of the warmongers, and about those few who in Bern, later in Zurich, often starving, always pressed for money, living in meager quarters, who planned to smash the rule of greed. Their feat in October still seems virtually unimaginable. That Lenin immediately put me to work, he said, spurred me on, but it also brought a certain sense of unease. His personality was so dominating, his strength as a leader so indisputable, that something inside of me still wanted to rebel against him. I never even came close to forming a connection with Trotsky. We young socialists were involved in printing and distributing his pamphlets about the war and the International, smuggling them across the border into Germany in the winter. In Trotsky's presence, something adventurous, anarchistic always arose. He was at once fanatic and bohemian, just as interested in discussing Jerry, Kandinsky, Marinetti, Picasso, or Decarigo as insurrectional strategy. With their conflicts fought out primarily in the press, Lenin and Trotsky complemented one another. Trotsky was the only one who dared to express his own opinion in front of Lenin. It was precisely because of this independence that Lenin appreciated him. Their hefty clashes were not testament to irreconcilable differences, but rather to an inextinguishable dialectical vitality. Just as the revolutionary moment could only develop out of antagonisms, out of paradoxical preconditions, artistic development was also unthinkable without tensions, conflict, extreme stress. It's not something I've often spoken about, said Moonsberg, and perhaps I am only now seeing it clearly, now that I've been maneuvered into this isolated position. But my political ideas were strongly linked to the image of a cultural revolution. In the summer before the Zimmerwald conference, in the clandestine meetings, the heated conversations among small groups of professional revolutionaries, we were steered in the direction that from then on was supposed to apply to all of our activities. The splinter groups from the old Erfurt Party found their way to a common line, declared their revolutionary program on the 5th of September. Our paper as well, Free Youth, was renamed Youth International. Relationships were being forged between countries. We could not imagine anything but the struggle against the war turning into a proletarian world revolution. Zimmerwald was a beginning, he said, full of half measures. And while we were organizing the next meeting in Kienthal in order to advance Lenin's International, the artistic revolts, seeming much more intransigent, more cunning than our activities, overtook us. That's it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read from... To give context for this next passage, the narrator in Volume 1 goes to Spain to fight in the international brigades. When they are dissolved, he retreats with his comrades over the border to Paris, where he spends a long time entranced with this painting, which is The Raft of the Medusa by Guernica. And I'm going to say now some stuff that's going to come up in here as well, but this wreck was a scandal for the restored Bourbon monarchy because they had sent out this expedition to a colonial port in Senegal. It was poorly captained because they had simply appointed a royalist to lead the mission, leading to a shipwreck. Thereafter, 150 people were put on a raft. Almost all of them died. And Guernica, fascinated by this, painted this, which caused an immense scandal. "You who are standing in front of this picture," said the painter, "you are the forsaken ones. Hope belongs to the ones you have abandoned." The corpse on the left had originally extended right to the foot of the parish youth perished youth on the foremost edge. Traces of the painted over forearm and hand could still be made out. Beneath the ribs, the torso seemed to be torn off. Either he had been caught between the planks, folded back into the cavity, or half of him had been devoured. 4 corpses lay up front in a row. Behind them, 3 figures were crouched, facing away from the rest. One by the mast, his face buried in his hands, followed by 4 bodies, half upright, intersected by one who had fallen back down. Then 4 standing up, huddled close together, and then the last 3, whom were holding up the one who was highest of all. A greenish-yellow shimmer lay over everyone's skin. As I had imagined the reproduction of the painting with Eichmann in Valencia, much of what was now revealed had already been discernible, but it wasn't until I was confronted with the work when I became an eyewitness and took in the event in its original character that I came to understand the magnitude of the act of painting it. I began to understand how the arrangement of the forms resulted from creating balances within a process of intensification, how the unity was pieced together out of contrasts. Precisely drawn, dark met with light, the illuminated contour of a profile, a back, a calf muscle always led to fabric, wood, or flesh lying in shadow, or the black outline of a head, a hand, a hip was set against shimmering cloth, sky, water. That which was contained, controlled in this entanglement, conveyed a sense of endurance, this quality being amplified by the fact that the perseverance seemed to be at the same time enveloped by a heavy sorrow. This emotion, the most abiding of all because of its connection with the irretrievable, found expression in the foreground in a full figure and appeared here and there with its shimmer on a brow, on a temple, a thrown-back cheekbone. And now the expression that had turned towards the possibility of survival with so much energy changed as well. The expectation of rescue was marked by apprehension. Waiting held sway, as in the situation in which the anxiety of a dream is to be broken through and wait. Those who believed they had seen what was approaching were turned away from the viewer. The few recognizable faces bore the rigidity of inward contemplation. There is a ship that you cannot see that's potentially approaching the raft. The only one who presented himself entirely to the outside world, who had open space in front of him, was the African. Here, the outline also vibrated. The lines of the shoulder, of the cheek seen from behind, of the hair were in the process of flowing into the crowd at its outermost highest point. The dissolution, the dispersion of the group began. As far as I could discern, this light blurring, this shaking of the outline, wasn't to be found anywhere else. The blurring must have been applied deliberately as a scarcely appreciable sign of the transgression of the limits of the acceptable. Here, where the transcendence began, the corporeal was also sculpted most starkly. The black colonial soldier Charles, the strongest of the castaways, though, according to the reports, he was also the first to die in Saint Louis after the rescue by the Argus, along with the sergeants Lozac and Claret, the cannoneer Cotard, the artillery sergeant Lavillette, and an unknown sailor from Toulon. Guernica had lived among these people while completing the preliminary studies during the hot summer. Before he began transferring the composition to the canvas, he often felt as if he were in Saint Louis, that small city on that island at the mouth of the Senegal River, where the rescued were hauled off the ship, hollow-eyed and bearded, and placed in a corner of the military hospital. Perhaps the patient asked himself if he shouldn't have just started here with a continuation of the agony on land. The isolated ocean journey was over, and they now found themselves back among sedentary people in a continuity. The English, who still had control of the garrison, didn't provide them with any help at all. After the weakest had died, the 9 survivors, the geographer Corial and the surgeon Savigny, the Captain Dupont and the Lieutenant Herre, the functionary Belay and the ensign Coudin, Coste, the sailor, Thomas, the pilot, and the nurse Francois, prepared themselves for a long period of imprisonment. Guernica lay among them, crawled on the filthy floor, tried a couple of wobbly steps, then, together with the few who were still able to walk, ventured out onto the street begging for alms. The flimsiness of the contracts had already been made evident. Since the French occupying troops didn't show up as announced, the English officers and officials saw no reason to leave the village. It wasn't until weeks later that the miserable heap of colonizers arrived after having landed farther north, unarmed and almost without clothes. While Géricault imagined being in Saint-Louis, the great theme of the confusion of an epoch once again began to take form in his vision of the painting. The white race, greedy, beset by violent antagonisms, came crawling onto the shores of Africa. Here and there, conquerors had set up shop. Following the shipwreck, the dispersed schlepped their emaciated bodies through the sand, dragging their contamination into a black culture already left shaken by centuries of the slave trade. Skipping ahead slightly to a description more about Géricault himself. The 10 years of his artistic activity were from the outset characterized by the same condition of captivity and by the same intensity with which he sought redemption. There was no hope or salvation for him. The tremendous energies which were stored up within him could only find intermittent relief in the pictures he produced. During his brief stay, with madness hanging over him all the while, painting was the instrument with which he confronted the excess pressure building up within him as a revolt against entropy. He who wanted to interrupt the system of oppression and destructiveness saw himself dying a defeated man. And yet it had never been so clear, but it had never before been so clear to me how values could be created in art which could overcome a sense of being penned in, being forsaken, as in his attempts to remedy his melancholy by giving form to his visions. Perhaps he didn't understand what these forces were that were holding him down. Perhaps he was so broken that he denied himself the key to interpretation for the signs he had laid bare. In his craft, though, he proceeded with enough awareness to realize that with his painterly language, he was laying the path for others. As he himself had carried on lines issuing from Michelangelo, Tintoretto, Caravaggio, with the strokes of their brushes, Daumier, Courbet, Degas, even Van Gogh, in his way, pointed toward Géricault. Suddenly, solving the riddle of his life no longer interested me. I knew everything I wanted to know. And our next reader is the diva of the hour, Joel Scott.
If I'm going to do 25 minutes, I'm going to have a water bottle. That's going to work. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Kay and Patrick for putting this together. It's really exciting to be here and to be reading in like a place like the Poetry Project. When we started and there was all this kind of like thunder coming from above, I was like, this is so like there's so many scenes in this book in which like, you know, intense discussions or like scenes are played out with like bombs thundering from the outside, and there's kind of always this sense of like the enclosed room in which people try to have interaction with each other or with art, and then history is always kind of caving in, sort of crashing in through the roof. So very appropriate. I'm going to read a few sections from Volume 3. I've always found public readings of prose to be a very strange thing to do, and I've only started doing it in reading from this book, and the last time I did it, I thought it was awful because I had to read until the point at which I had previously chosen to end at, because that was a nice ending, but then halfway through it, like I was reading far too long. But unlike a poetry reading where you can just like throw away 3 of your poems halfway through the reading, in a prose reading you kind of have to just keep going. And so today I tried to pick out a few sections, or kind of like cut and paste things together So I'm going to just kind of read sections and then skip along. They're taken from two sections. The first is the beginning of volume 3, and the second section is towards the end, when the kind of protagonists have been arrested and they're in prison. They're about to be executed. The section at the start begins with the narrator's parents and their flight from Czechoslovakia towards and kind of the way that they come into contact with the expulsion of Jews and other groups moving through Europe, and primarily his mother's interaction with that, because I guess you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. She knelt in the snow but wasn't cold. Perhaps it was actually soft white sand. Her hands delved deeper and deeper, the light was blinding, even though the sky was veiled with clouds. She plunged her arms in up to her elbows, lifted them up, and snowflakes fluttered from her hands. It was a constant up and down in a regular motion. Others were kneeling in front of her. She could see backs wrapped in grey, shredded rags. She could see their naked feet, saw soles and toes half covered by the white of the snow, and she stuck her hands in even deeper. It must have been a beach they were kneeling on, facing away from the sea, whose edge was close, but there was no sound of lapping waves. There was total silence. They were like children digging a moat, and there were indeed children among the women who were kneeling before her. Some of them had removed clothing in the warmth. The skin on their shoulders and hips glistened as they bent and stretched their bodies, and so it went, without pause. My mother's face was empty and dull, her mouth half open. Her eyes were staring into the distance and didn't look at me. My father sat beside her in silence, holding her hand in his own. Outside, through the window, the pruned-back trees of the schoolyard were turning green. My mother knew that this digging could not go on forever, but she kept the inevitable at bay. There was a shimmer around the figures issuing from the warmth of the summer's day, the overheated bodies. This couldn't be winter, because then the ground would be frozen. Their hands would not have been able to plunge in so easily and fly back up. They would have had to scratch their way into the earth. Still, she sensed something leathery, something metallic lurking behind her, and the stronger her sense of it grew, the more impossible it became for her to turn around. But she knew that it had heads and claws, and that it didn't even need to touch her to annihilate her. The tiniest movement, a mere puff of air, was all it had taken to get every back to straighten, and she too had no option but to cease her digging, which had almost become a soothing activity. And there they knelt. She watched how their spines tautened, how the feet and toes of the children bored into the sand, and nobody looked back. My father stood up and stepped toward the window. He waved me over and pointed diagonally, directing my eye past the school and toward the freshly painted, light grey facade of the factory on the other side of the street. This line, from the room in the apartment to the factory where he had found work, lent his existence a kind of stability, making it seem as if the year between my parents' departure from Varnsdorf and their arrival in this small Swedish industrial city had not been filled with the darkest wandering. My parents' departure from part of the great wandering. Gazes were directed across the seas toward other continents. Harbours such as Marseille, Genoa, Rotterdam, Lisbon, Odessa, Istanbul were sites of an oracle, a magical hope. Consulates and embassies had become temples, their thresholds damp from kisses and tears. This begging for papers, for stamps in a passport, a place in the quotas, was the most natural, normal thing. A visa represented a form of absolution, and this was only provided to those who possessed the money to buy themselves mercy. The masses of those who had no more to offer than their desperation swelled, and desperation was the most worthless of all superfluous things. And soon enough, those who only yesterday had been wealthy found themselves among the expropriated, and the only thing left was the descent into aimless wandering, with no way out. no refuge. We were supposed to try to get to Warsaw too, said my father, and then head to the Swedish embassy there, where Taub was going to leave instructions for us. But how were we, part of the hordes of those without influence, supposed to get through Poland and plead our case with the Swedish ambassador, he said, as he held my mother's coffee cup to her mouth. In front of her, she saw the backs, naked or covered with rags, broad, round backs and small, slender ones. She saw how they were made to shudder by an invisible force that flung them forward, sending a dark stream shooting out of their flesh, and how they disappeared into the ditch, as deep as their hands had dug. My father held the back of her head, carefully fed her a piece of cake, and wiped her chin. In late May of '39, my parents had managed to reach the so-called tri-point, because of Silesia, the Czech territories, and Poland met. They didn't have any luggage with them, just the advance that my father had received in Polish, which was sewn into the seam of his jacket. Amid the chaotic movement in which they found themselves, another superior force was perceptible, one that shook nerves and tendons, that pushed them forward and swept them away with it, a meticulously calculated force that proceeded according to set plans. And while the refugees clung to the notion that borders could still be crossed, countries traversed, destinations reached, the paths and roads they were taking were funneling them toward a machinery that aimed to divide them up, separate them from one another, and count them before consigning them to be liquidated, some slowly, some quickly. While they still gave themselves in the landscapes they moved through names, they numbers, and the various regions had been renamed. The mutilated cadaver of Czechoslovakia had produced a Bohemian and Moravian protectorate and a supposedly autonomous Slovakian. The Sudetenland had been consumed by the Reich, with Poland and Hungary snapping up the crumbs. Border stations had been moved. It was unclear who the ground they were standing on belonged to. Even those who had previously felt that they belonged more to their country than to a race, those who, when the first signs of persecution emerged, had still considered themselves to be respected members of the community, now had to accept their position as exiles and outcasts. These people, who still harboured memories of a life of their own, were already beginning to see like the blind. In the eyes of hidden observers, they were nothing more than a herd that was to be slaughtered as cheaply as possible. These flows, which dribbed and drabbed through the blossoming landscapes toward the east, and whose ripples were the dust picked up by their now grey shoes, were being approached from the east by raging tides, bringing waves of trucks adorned with wreaths of leaves and little flags. Over there a surge of screamed hires, of victorious delirium, rushing into the homeland of the Reich, while over here a stream of wanderers would slow, swerving to evade the mangling squall, forming exhausted, shapeless clusters, then charging ahead again frantically, allowed to walk themselves to exhaustion, so that later, when the opportune moment arrived, they would be easier to catch or would walk into the trap on their own. My father mentioned a cramped cell. My mother's fingers stirred, as if feeling for something. They run along the grooves, the grain of a stone wall. A musty smell rose up from the sawdust-strewn. More than 100 people were corralled into the cell together. The few cots were shared in hourly rotation, given to the children, women with infants, the sick. The bucket that served as a toilet was overflowing. Some of the old people died, were dragged to the doorway between the feet of those standing about. Walking and sleeping, the bodies clung to one another. My mother felt the dense warmth to these sweating bodies. She grasped one of the hot hands, enveloping its fingers, and as their hands clung to one another, she pressed her face against a moist cheek. Arms, breasts, hips, stubbly beards, a massive beating hearts, wheezing breaths, and being surrounded by them lent her strength. For her, the putrid discharge was like a blossoming. She drew the smell in deep. She lived in this organism. She wanted to be part of this closeness forever. Being separated from it would be her doom, her demise. 1 week, I heard my father say, we spent in that dungeon. My mother would have stayed there had my father not grabbed her as they were driven out into the courtyard and arranged into rows to be transported to a camp, dragging her with him to the group who could prove themselves to be of German extraction. For a few weeks they wandered, often together with groups of Czech and Slovakian Jews, toward the railway hub of Oswiecim, where they wanted to wait for a train to Warsaw. Eventually they got close to Bielsko-Biała, which my father knew as Bielitz from his time in the Austro-Hungarian army. Walking through a field in the early morning, they heard the sound of a plane. Something dark fell from it. Someone's fallen out, my mother said. It was a pointy clump that caused the earth to burst. They threw themselves into the dried out ditches beneath the willow trees and lay there for a long time, because a buzzing could be heard, like the motors of a large, still distant squadrons, a droning that drew nearer with a peculiar slowness, gradually increasing in volume. The wheat fields were glowing in the morning sun. Not a single cloud hung in the sky. There was no breeze moving the ripe ears of wheat, but deep below, among the blades, the poppies, there was a flitting and scurrying. Small animals raced past, lizards, mice, rabbits, even snakes. The noise grew to a jingling and roaring, as if thunderous hailstorms were descending, but the skies remained bright and blank. They pressed their hands against their ears out of the fear that the blaring, whose origins had still not revealed itself, might cause their eardrums to burst. And they thought that the earth that was now quaking beneath them would open up. Suddenly, as if felled by a scythe, the grain crops fell. Grey monsters waltzed over on rotating caterpillar chains with arched, armoured backs in dense rows. My mother pressed herself into the crumbling ground. Through the leaves of grass, she saw how the raised barrels above her, pushing into the grain, the steel bodies mowing through them and trailing off into the distance. New swarms came, rattling and screeching. One time, a pair of eyes stared down at her through a slit. Sand crunched between her teeth. The patch of ground before her was full of furrows and fissures. An ant, which was carrying a dead ant, paddled with its feelers over an abyss before extending its front legs to reach over it. A black beetle scaled a blade of grass until it began to list, and it crawled back down. I was talking to a very good friend, Charlotte Thiessen, who read all of the translation, all of volume 2 and 3, line for line, and compared everything to the German. And she was asking me which sections I was going to read today, and she was like, "Are you going to read the ant?" And I was like, "Yes." I always have to read the ant. Yeah, and then this next section is probably one of the weirdest things in the book. So you've got to imagine they're in prison, 1942. They've all been caught. They're all about to be executed. And then Heilmann, who we heard about before, who was 15 when the novel began and is now 19 when he's about to be executed, writes a letter from his cell, because they all are allowed to write letters from their cells, because it's German bureaucracy, and it's kind of that's what it says in the relevant statutes. And Heilmann writes a letter to Unknown, which kind of we sort of presume is to his friend, to the narrator, sort of back in Sweden. But it's the most wild letter, particularly if you imagine the context in which it's being written. I mean, you'll see that it's totally kind of off the chain. And it's just kind of so incredible that it kind of had to be part of what I read tonight. So I'm going to start about halfway through and then do the same thing of kind of jumping through certain sections. These corridors, which buzz with whispered intimations that reach our ears while we are hanging, dazed, from the arms of the wardens, these walls through which messages penetrate, consisting of the sound of a voice, the rhythm of steps, only rarely a word, and which we, with our heightened senses, are able to understand. There would be much to say about the abyss into which each is sinking, about the stone we taste on our tongues, and which, through our mental straining, sometimes seems to become porous, like dough, into which we could dig our fingers, and when our hands then feel the hardness of it, we're overcome by a sense of confusion. Indeed, if the last few months have been spent training mental capacities that were largely unused before, what was notable about it was always that any insights, any flashes of epiphany would go dark just as quickly as they had appeared. Do you remember how we used to do those exercises? We would usually start with a dream, eventually arriving at visions that outstripped everything we had previously known. Come back to that other thing that I still need to say. I want to briefly address this brittle yet highly expressive material that forms a part of us. So much has been written about it, yet the only worthwhile texts are the ones that are written from within these visions, by Hölderlin, for example, or Rimbaud. We spoke about seeing in dreams, asked ourselves how, out of complete darkness, colours of such vibrancy could emerge. They are produced by our knowledge about light. Knowledge sees. There is no light stimulus, just the memory of it. We ascertained that dreams contain those most primal of images, sharp and precise in every detail, which are then overlaid by an astounding range of reflections, intuitively arranged from different fields of experience. They accumulate, or rather, they float, bob around in the various emotional centres, gather out like sperm to the ovum, lead to perpetual fertilization. Every sensing cell seems to be receptive, causing new forms to appear through the constant flux of impulses. No semblance ever emerges. It cannot emerge because of the flow, but related elements gather in particular regions, depending on the strength of the pull, the extent to which the impulse pervades the underlying pattern. And sometimes, the original image then rises to the surface, at which point, like a flash, everything that had been deposited on top of it is washed away. If, though, in the dream, we feel a desire to revisit something that had been so close to us just a moment ago, be it a person, a place, there is always something in the way. Such a desire can only come from half sleep, for only in waking do we want to repeat, rethink. Nothing can be seen again in a dream. Only when ambiguity regains the upper hand can the feeling of expectation emerge, and this expectation, drenched in the chemistry that is produced by each encounter, forms combinations, situations that edge closer to what the longing of the sleeper had been aiming at. Once, in St. Hedvig's cemetery, we spoke about how dreams were only bearable because in sleep we are under a kind of anesthetic. Though we're deep within the realm of the body, we don't perceive bodily pain in the dream. All manner of agonies are present, but they don't even surprise us. We had come out of the short, narrow street you lived on. Behind us, the trains at Stettin railroad station were rolling along. Whenever we were approaching great difficulties, we first familiarised ourselves with our surroundings, took in the buildings, their mouldings, their history, the solid courses of the streets. They're not solid anymore. Helped to gird our thoughts. We were trying to grasp what was beyond recognition. In dreams, I was a body struggling to learn how to think. This wheezing, this babbling, from which words might emerge, resembles the sounds that form the only language we have heard here for a long time. You could say that we've been living in the language of the dream, that language of the soul, and because this language knows no morals, no responsibility, I was once again able to get closer to her, the weakest, most childlike one among us. We see shredded skin and we accept it. Gentle reflection on a brow, the grace of a gesture moves us to tears that wake us up. She jumped out of a flying train that was supposed to take her to a castle garden. Now she was cowering on the stone floor. She too had been handed materials to write her final letter, and thus we are all united by our message, which, like the Christian soul, leaves the bodily husk and everything within it. But life, no matter what dungeon it's tossed into, is no dream. I'm no Christian. I live in the here and now. Like all of us, I too, amid the beatings, have sought refuge in the innermost regions of my shell. I have hallucinations of those boulevards that still bear the lush green that was long ago stripped off by the fall and the winter. Perhaps there is now snow on the branches and on the inclined roof below the 5th floor window we used to gaze through. And though the time we have left is now rapidly running out, It doesn't mean that the capacity of our consciousness will be reduced by 1 iota before our last second. In fact, it grows stronger. Because it is no longer of use to anyone, it tries to make us even more insightful. And so, just as these enormous structures emerge during sleep, in my waking hours, the reflections of the material world present themselves to me, melding countless sources into a single, ever-present whole. In terms of proportions, the dream is to this image what the individual is to the entirety of humanity. And if these processes, which issue from the roots of thinking, remain puzzling to us, how much greater does our curiosity need to be for us to get a sense of the connections beyond our own selves? If the things we see by night belong to us alone, the constructions created by everyone else are sealed off from us, though not completely. The effects of all this activity can still be perceived by everyone else, but each of us perceives them only as individuals. Each of us absorbs whatever is relevant to us, processes it internally, and with the conclusions we draw from it, we give something of ourselves back to the others. I'm thinking about this in order to find an answer to the question of why we don't feel the suffering we witness in dreams. Ultimately, the same encounters play out in dreams and in waking life. The world of the dream, which is no bigger than the mind, scrolls back through what surrounded us outside, conveys to us the dimensions of everything we are able to experience. But while in the outside world we are afforded the ability to sift, separate, disassemble, and reject, in the dream we are inundated by material that bears no visible purpose and provides succor only to the life within us. If we remain numb in the face of the suffering that takes place before our dreaming eyes, this indicates the absence of the moral and ethical qualities that determine our waking existence. Only that which affects us personally exists in the dream. Even the instinctive fear, the impulse to flee, we're always retreating deeper inside of ourselves to escape the dangers that beleaguer us outside. We are being chased, and as soon as we sense that they could be just around the corner, they rear their heads from behind that ever-flimsy protective veil. And everything possesses such a peculiar force because it is after us and us alone, because we are subjected to these attacks in an elementary sense. If we step outside into the waking world, we instantly become alienated from ourselves and enter into the total pain in which we all live. And though we are still unable to feel the bodily pain of our neighbour there, our consciousness of the total pain steps in to drive us to feel sympathy, to try to help. And if it is in vain, and the person who was dearest to us is torn apart before our eyes, the despair can grow so great that we want to end our own life, because only by extinguishing our powerlessness for all can we attain peace. Thus, in dreams, we are divested of our empathetic, responsible self, while in waking life, we lose access to our innermost truths. When you've been alone for a long time, the language that no longer seeks to be understood by others begins to take over. And now I feel lightheaded as I turn my thoughts to the world outside of me, which I'll never see again. This feeling of leaning out into the outside world is similar to that of exploring a dream, because in both cases, we're looking out of one world into an entirely different one. Inside of me, I saw a wild frenzy, a vast and violent scramble. Outside, behind the gates, the other phantasmagoria unfurls, in which you two are progressing along your path, between tides that are racing toward each other. I recognize cities, countries, continents. Well, I don't recognize them, I imagine them. And the precision of the memory of these sights and of the explanations others gave of them lends me something of the magnitude that is in the reality of the world. I grow dizzy because it was so difficult to break through the walls around me and to get some sense of how much of what I've said is still echoing in other people, through which parts of my being continue to exist, allowing them to be awoken at any moment. I'm not talking about dreams anymore, because I'll never fall asleep again. If I look at us like this, us 11 of the first batch, sitting in these real physical cells, the isolation in which we were previously penned up disappears. Even if we had died without being able to leave behind a message for the outside world, we wouldn't have felt that we'd been forgotten. It was only a few hours ago that we were driven in chains through the noise of the city in an armoured vehicle. 8 men, the 3 women were transported separately. Various ages, from different contexts of German history, sitting across from one another on the narrow benches. their carbines trained on us. Even a single word would have been smashed by the butt of a rifle, and yet, what a language of communion developed between our gazes. Our friend had gotten the chance to see his child, the one his partner had given birth to, surrounded by concrete walls. And I'm sure that at this moment, many write to their children, who will not be able to grow older within them, to their beloveds, who have to carry on our lot. And the fact that we are afforded the chance to write forms part of the regulations that seek to convey the impression that even here, we were still shown a vestige of humanity. And I did write to my parents, but this is my parting letter. O Heracles, the light is dim, the pencil dull. I wish I'd written everything differently, but time's too short, and the paper's at its end.
I feel like thank you is inadequate, but we're gonna sit down and have a conversation, the four of us. So let's get out some chairs. Wow. Really impressive slapstick there, thank you.
All right, with mics, right?
Yeah. Thanks so much to James and Noah, our text tonight. And to Gary, who's doing the video. And to my colleagues Heather and Maren and our volunteers, and to you guys for coming. Yeah. Okay. Okay, first question for Joel. Tell us in whatever detail you want to about translating Weiss's German. I imagine this could be an entire dissertation, but I'm really curious what stands out in his language, what was particularly challenging to put into English, and what should we be listening for as readers of Aesthetics of Resistance in translation?
I read this question, now I feel like it's, I've made notes and thought about it, but now it feels like it's new to me. I mean, I guess, you know, if you've looked at the book, like the actual kind of visual form of the book, which the Satzbild, like the kind of typesetting image, it's, you know, the sentence along, the paragraphs are non-existent. Like, it just has these like punctual breaks like throughout the book, and that's largely something that is imminent to the German language as a whole. But Weiss definitely kind of like takes that to the extreme in terms of like, working with language as kind of almost like in a sculptural sense, and also in a kind of like a creative, like is that a word? Like I think it's a massively synthetic text, like it's attempting to synthesize everything. It's often been described as monstrous, kind of like, and like that's something that the narrator also kind of says in volume 1, right? Like he's kind of like asking the question of like, how would we depict this experience that like we're living in which we don't own anything, and which we're kind of we don't have this like organizing sphere in which we exist, to create an interior, essentially like a kind of bourgeois interior. And he says like, the form would have to be monstrous. And something that a lot of early reviewers kind of also like took that up and described it as like monstrous and brutal and kind of awful to read. And it's, that's not fair. But it is unwieldy. And it's doing things that you can do in German that you can't actually do in English, to a certain extent. And so, I tried to kind of keep those structures and those qualities as much as I could, but I also deliberately, like Weiss also doesn't use the only punctuation he uses is commas and periods. There's no question marks, there's no quotation marks, there's no dashes, there's no anything else, colons, semicolons, anything. And, I think I tried to do that for a couple of pages or something, and then realized that was an absolutely idiotic thing to do, because you just can't make those sentences readable in English. Like we can't read sentences like, the Germans have many wonderful and many awful qualities. But what they can do is like, they can structure a sentence like over, like what we would call a paragraph. And like, also in conversation, they can speak in that way as well, because there's this grammatical thing where like if you have two verbs in a sentence, the second verb goes to the end. So like, if you're just talking to somebody, you say like, I would like, and you're going to say like, I would like to rob that bank. Like you can put in a whole bunch of things before you get to the verb rob the bank. So like the person has to listen to everything that you're saying the entire time before they find out what the sentence is actually about. They just know that until then that it's about something that you would like to do. And so like grammatically, like German readers can do that as well. They can kind of like start a sentence and like all these other things can happen, and they're like, it's okay. Like we're gathering kind of color and structure, and like, which is also allows like, I can, through this, I can try to like put everything in, like the individual perception of reality, like the occurrence of world historical events, the house falling down around me, and then there's the actual kind of perceptive moment that kind of comes at the end. We can't really read that way. And so, I had to find ways to break up the sentences, often cut them in half, rearrange them, put in dashes, put in I'm kind of unhappy with my use of semicolons in a way, because like, I think it's incredibly unsystematic actually, but I kind of like, I tried to use as few as possible, but then they all started to seem arbitrary, but then there were just kind of points where I'd be like, okay, I need a bigger break here, because otherwise you can't read this sentence. And I don't want to break this one up, because I've already broken it up into 4 sentences or something. And I think at least in volume 2, I used 1 or 2 question marks because people who read it they were like, you just can't read this as a question, like this sentence, and it is a question, and you can get that in the German, but you can't get it here. So I was like, okay, then put a question mark in.
Can I ask a quick follow-up for that? Because the first volume has a different translator, and I wonder, is it something he also stuck to like make these adaptations that you ended up making with these like, question marks or dashes?
He did similar things. Yeah, he also used dashes, and also kind of like went away from that. I mean, I kind of only like I tried to like sort of not read the translation in a way to like not be too influenced by it. But then once I kind of got to this point of realizing that I would need to do this, I then kind of checked volume 1 and I was like, oh right, yeah, he did it anyway. So like it's already, that backs me up, and also the kind of purity of the original has already been ruined anyway. So it's like, it's fine, I think. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of what we should be looking for, I don't know. I mean, yeah. Ultimately, like I wanted it to read well, but like hew as close to the original as I could, but then also kind of move away where I felt like it needed it. And that's super. That's a totally arbitrary thing to say, I think. But
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, you get to be arbitrary. You did the work. Sebas and Adi, you guys, you had this, what I kept hearing updates about as a really exciting, fertile, thrilling reading group experience. So I'm going to guess that it wasn't monstrous and difficult and awful to read for you. But I'm wondering if you guys want to talk about just like the texture of that, of like approaching this book together with your close friends.
Our friend Sam is here in the back too, who is also in our reading group.
Thanks for being here.
And I think it's really it was really relentless and overwhelming for me, and I couldn't read it on my own, to be honest, I think. And I don't think I would have. For me, it's like, there's this dialectical experience that happens inside of it that also is like, it necessitated for me a container, the soft, joyful, little hors d'oeuvres and wine book club, and to get through these 25, 50-page chunks that we would do, and it kind of, I don't know, how long did we, a year, 8 months, a year maybe, and then we're gonna do the next volume. And but it really, for me, in this, like, that was the book for me. That was part of the book, the learning community that formed around it. Also, yeah, it's both overwhelming, relentless, and it's brutal. It's not only in form and aesthetic of how it's put together, but the content is just brutal. And you need to, and it's like, you need to process, you need to talk through it, to move through it. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think like being in a reading group helps to not have a relationship to the book that's basically just about appreciating it or enjoying it. We were trying to sort of do the gesture that the book does of retrieving what it's talking about to talk about political problems now, and that's easier to do with other people, and to like through questions or disagreements and so on. And I think that was really important.
Yeah. I mean, this is reminding me how one of Weiss's points of interest is the technologies and infrastructures that working class people in the period that the book is talking about, as well as before it, develop and use to think and act together. And so the Social Democratic Party in Germany and the unions that it was powerful in, and using those to train people to think in particular ways. Now, actually, there's a critique that the father has that they don't do that enough, and that's one of the reasons why the Nazis had an easier path to power. But there's an interest in like, oh, what are these technologies that are already there for people to think together? Sebas, you asked a question in our email thread that I'm going to re-ask here. Complex ideas, political problems, major world historical events, subjective experiences and perceptions, all of these are put in very long text blocks that drive forward almost relentlessly. It's hard to isolate them. This tells us something about thinking and acting politically. What does it tell us? I guess one of the questions, when I wrote this down, I asked you how this style shaped your translation, which I think you kind of addressed, but if you want to talk more about it, please do. And for all of us, how does it shape our reading of the novel?
I think, I guess like we had an event yesterday and we kind of touched on this question a little bit in that, and I guess this is something also that that Frederick Jameson talks about in his foreword to volume 1, is that it kind of it necessitates, like you have to learn to read in a certain way, like to read the book, and I guess that. And he kind of talks about, I guess Jameson mentions like the nouveau roman as like a kind of another kind of writing that was like training people to read differently, but this is doing something quite different. And I think it is true that it's also trying to make you read differently so that you can conceive of politics differently, and so that you can actually start to situate yourself within like a totality and within a historical continuum and like within these kinds of things in which you can then be active, and that like that's going to be extremely difficult. So it's like kind of almost like if you can't learn to read a book, then you're not going to learn to intervene decisively in history or something.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Because you said this, I think, really cool and kind of strong thing, that this book was like learning how to think for the first time.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean it really literally. I think, and okay, this is something I think that makes this particular book's difficulty appealing and different, and let's say really unique among like an interesting, challenging modernist novel that I'm gonna knock my head against to teach myself something, which maybe you share this with me and you like to do. The book requires you to take extremely seriously other people's patterns of thought and how they move from stimulus and reasoning, perspective, upbringing, education, condition, to my decision, this is what I think is going on, this is what I think I have to do. And to take that and you to walk with that cognition step by painful step or challenging step. And not always as a process of reasoning, as Joel started. Sometimes it's a process of sense perception, but it's always kind of taking us somewhere where you are forced to understand somebody else. You can't step back from their position and think, well, I'm not going to take them seriously. At that point, you might just not read it, right? And then that's happening while the world is breaking in, your point that you were making earlier, from outside, something that Rachel said last night, you know, the characters are having a long conversation, like a months-long conversation while they talk. Hungary, Poland, Greece, et cetera, all fall to the Nazis. Like that happens in a span of like weeks, right? So history is happening under our feet while we're also trying to figure out what is going on and what we do about it. And at the same time, people are sorting through their like psychoanalytic drives. I guess that's kind of what I mean by it's like learning to think. Like you're actually being reintroduced to your own habits of mind by way of taking the habits of mind of other people extremely seriously. And through that process, it's like this development, this kind of forced development of what we've been calling like our Marxist theory of mind, that we if I can just like give away one of the theses in this essay that we've been writing together, is like part of how this book trains us to be politically effective at any point, but especially in a period of intense coercion and suppression. So that's what I meant.
Amazing.
Can I react to it
Please.
for a second? Because I think it does, you know, after we read the first 2 volumes, we started reading Proust. And it just like, in a sense, it's like the rhythm of the, you know, it's not a stream of consciousness. It's like a thundering train or a long never stops. And with other people's, it's not just an individual's thought, a system of thought. It is this kind of bustling, overwhelming, everything's crashing in, the parents, the friends, the comrades from across the sea, the, you know, historical figures that aren't even known, getting kind of falling into the book of plates and the paintings and being in Jericho's mind and his bizarre psychology, whatever it is, it doesn't, you don't have that time to just settle into the water kind of, it's just so forceful and wrathful and keeps going. But I think that to me is that kind of realistic way of dealing with thought and how it functions, rather than like, oh, it's just me and my little, you know, la-di-da, the romantic of it maybe. It's a little more dealing with conditional reality as it is, and how difficult and confusing. And you know that in the Frederick Jameson Ford, there's this graphic that I can't really recollect or describe, but it's bizarre, and it is this matrix of, you know, and it kind of says, okay, there's all these different things. And it just, yeah, it treats it as very, very complex, messy system, and I like that.
I mean, it's also, I feel like it's kind of, it's like I feel like every sentence at the moment, like, is like, particularly right at this moment. Like we're going to need to, like, we need to be able to think like this, right? Like, because any conversation that we have, any relationship that we have that we will ever want to kind of like write about or like think about aesthetically or like purpose or package aesthetically, like, is also going to be happening at the same time as, like, you know, what are the historical political events that like happened this week, that happened in the last month, that happened, you know, like that's like what we are embedded within. And so like if we're going to make sense of anything that we're actually kind of experiencing outside of those, or like, you know, within private relationships or within like we have to be able to do that, or we're just kind of or we're lying. Like we're not making sense of anything. We're not depicting anything. Like, yeah.
I think the ways of thinking also, it feels like there's no something that would always come up in the group was like didn't feel like there was a resolution ever. It didn't feel like there was an answer offered. It was just this kind of frustration of like, how can I be organized? How can I deal with this? How can I be? Yeah.
I think I would offer a different characterization, because the book could have, meticulously notates what these characters are up to, and and kind of formalizes the problem that we all have of the overwhelming amount of choices that we have to make every day about what we want or need to study, or what struggle we are a part of or will be a part of, and they choose specific things, and a lot of these things fail. They go to the Spanish Civil War, and then are refugees and exiles once the war is lost to Franco. And and it tracks and notates a lot of these failures. And I think one of the the biggest ones is about the failure of the Popular Front in the 30s, right? Yeah. With the ability of the Social Democratic Party and the Communists to come together to fight fascism. And it's in these sort of problems and failures where it's sort of easy to or good to retrieve something like a lesson, or to do a sort of allegorical reading. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think both of those points are actually really important. One is the kind of like taking seriously the well-reasoned positions that people come with, the well-reasoned positions that people come to, that you get in exhausting detail about what they think is going on in Spain, what they're doing about it, about the attempts to build a popular front, the failures, the multiple rounds of failure at different stages and in different countries to form a viable popular front. A little taste of what's in Germany, in France. In Spain, it's the most durable, but of course they still lose. In Sweden. So we get those really well-reasoned debates, but Addie is right, they don't resolve. And it's like didactic in a Brechtian way, where you're being shown a lot that you have to make decisions about and think, what would I do differently? How could this have been avoided, or whatever? But it's not didactic in the sense that Weiss is showing you as if in a courtroom drama who is in the wrong. You never get that. You never get that payoff, and you never get that certainty. Right. I think.
I think that's right.
It's related to a question that I sent you guys, which I do want to ask. Something that stands out in the form of the novel is the always productive and often antagonistic disagreements between the characters about art, political practice, the next right thing to do. It's arguably Weiss's main technique for writing dialectically. Adi, you already made that point. Thinking in real time from opposing perspectives about conditions as they shift and change. So, what interpretive disagreements have you encountered in reading Aesthetics of Resistance and talking about it with people around you, and what did those disagreements make clear to you in a different way? Joel, I'm curious as well. If
I was curious to hear because I kind of didn't read it in a reading group, or I started reading it in a reading group, but the reading group fell apart, and then I did it on my own. I mean, I had countless very intense disagreements of interpretation, kind of at the level of semantics, like at the kind of like level of the text. Like only very, very rarely did those disputes actually kind of like, probably on 3 or 4 occasions did they actually rise to the level of like what this could possibly be saying about politics, because there's a handful of kind of statements in the book which are written in like such a cryptic way that as a translator, like you read them and you kind of think, I'm getting this, and you kind of translate it, and then you read what you've translated and you think like, I certainly don't know what that's supposed to mean. So you think I must have not understood the German correctly, and you read it again, and you kind of like try to think about, like there's a couple of things that, like when he's like talking about like why he failed in Spain or something. I remember like one or two sentences where I just thought like, what is the fucking argument here actually? And, you know, and I went, you know, I took this to Lottie, who like read the whole thing, and like, you know, we would sometimes like, we would start to speculate about like what this sentence might be supposed to be saying, like as a political reading of the situation, and then usually we would kind of be like, shit, but like actually my understanding of the historical context is like actually too patchy to like know whether that would even be a plausible reading here. And you know, one of us would kind of like come up with a really brained like reading, like maybe he's trying to say this, which then I would kind of be like, okay, but like if that's the case, should I then write that? Like, you know, is that how I should translate it so that it would actually be understandable as like that's what's being said here? But yeah, there was only a couple of then I asked a bunch of people. I went to people who know the text better than me, who know the historical context better than me, and there are a couple of occasions where like people kind of like, look, like what you're suggesting seems plausible to me. Like I would maybe, like my guess might be this, but like, you know, there's a couple of sections that I kind of like sort of did in like kind of pen and ink or something, like kind of like washed over, and was kind of like, you know, because nobody could kind of tell me what that really should be saying. And then I had countless kind of like often quite tense disputes with Lottie about like the meanings of particular words, when she would kind of often like she would be like, no, that's not what that means, and I'd just be like so sure that was how he was using a word. And so then, you know, I have other people, then I have like other instances to go to, like then I go to my partner Tabea and I go like, Lottie said this, but like I'm sure it's this, and 9 times out of 10 Tabea would be like, no, Joel, like Lottie's right, like she's the German, you're the English person, and then every now and then like Tabea would be like, no, Lottie's wrong, like that's, or she'd be like, yeah, your theory sounds as plausible as anything else. So there was lots of that, and occasionally I would kind of find a way of. Sometimes I would kind of realize that like once or twice I like cracked a code that he was actually using words in a kind of like literal way, like in a way that like doesn't actually get used in common usage. And I would be like, but that's actually the only way to understand this word, is if you kind of understand it as its composite parts.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's not like kind of properly interpretive or something.
I mean, it's so cool that you had this intense collaborative relationship.
I wouldn't have.
So even if you
it.
didn't like a reading group, you had another mind that was going over every word with you.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have done it without that. Like, I wouldn't have taken it on. Like, because it was.
Because you can't.
No, and it's like you can't and you shouldn't. And I mean, I don't think people really should translate things without those kinds of relationships. And like, especially a text like this, like, I think it would be incredible. It would have been incredibly arrogant to kind of think like, oh, I can read this and figure it out myself. And so that was almost like a condition for me to do it. I was like, Lottie, you have to do it with me. And then I was like, you know, I'm getting paid next to nothing, so I'll pay you part of what I'm getting. I'll pay you like too little of my too little. And then she did the third volume. Most of her work on that was done like at night, because her daughter was like, you know, kind of less than a year, and like would, you know, she would kind of like talk to me, like she would give me timelines that I had to work to get her like the pieces so that she could keep up with, like we were kind of working in sync so that she could do like, because she could get 2 hours done at night, like while Alma was asleep, and then, you know, and then I've got these things coming up, so I can do that. And so we were kind of constantly I was like, okay, well then I need to get my sections finished so that I can give them to you, and you can give them back to me. Yeah, but otherwise it wouldn't have worked.
Totally.
Yeah.
JLS, do you have a response to Kay's question?
About the disagreements?
Yeah.
Can I ask you first about it in your reading group?
Sure. Okay, there's this.
We just rehearsed one, right?
Yeah, you guys did, which was cool. I guess one prominent moment. It's in volume 2. There's a really long. He's like the narrator's like, I live in Sweden now, so I should learn everything I can of Swedish left. So you get 100 pages, 100 pages of splits among the Swedish Social Democrats. And
the 14th century mine rebellion.
yes, and
in
it's actually,
Denmark.
it is fascinating. It's fascinating. Don't be scared. It's fascinating, and it's all interspersed at the same time. He's also working with Brecht. He's like a minor artisan in Brecht's shop, working together on a play that Brecht, in fact, did try to made notes for writing, but didn't out. The leader, this guy Engelbrecht, who led a peasant and minor rebellion in Sweden in the 15th century, and who was very effective in throwing off foreign rule. And then when he started threatening the power of the local nobility, they kill him. So as this is continuing, you get this argument. Effectively, this 100-page long argument between someone who's a communist, who this guy Rugby, who the narrator knows from fighting together in Spain, and this guy Strom, who's on the left wing of the Swedish Social Democrats, and they're really going back and forth. And then Patrick observed, they don't actually ever, these two characters who are disagreeing with each other, they're never in the same room. The disagreements are entirely told by separate conversations that the narrator is putting together as if they're talking to each other, but they're not. So that's one observation. That wasn't the disagreement. The disagreement was, I was just ready to write off the Social Democrat. I was like, you're a fucking coward. This guy is capitulating. It's a story of capitulation. It's a story of compromise. It's a story of severe lack of strategy. When another way was possible, and this other side is demonstrating it. And I don't even know if I had the balls to come to our reading group with that perspective. But Patrick said this observation. The tragic thing is that it's not that they're both wrong; they're both right. Like reading these people, we actually are made to see that they are both right, and in fact both make mistakes. There's this one sentence where it's we needed time, said Strom, but there was no time, said Rugby. So it's like, do you think that fascism is right here, or do you think that the threat is coming in 20 years? That will decide. I mean, obviously we know what our situation is, right? But let's say we were trying to make a decision about how to act, I don't know, 9 months ago, right? Whether we think the crisis is near or far determines what kind of coalition we want to build. Do we attack the liberals? Do we walk with them? What are the decisions that we're making in order to actually make gains for the class that we take ourselves to be fighting on behalf of? And so that was a perspective that I was like, I have been I'm gonna take my my ideological bone to pick and throw it away.
When all the while the narrator is also working in a factory, working in Brecht's workshop, and thinking what do we do now? All he's hearing is these kind of self-destructive, failing movements from his father, from these, in the first volume, and from these characters, and they're getting ready to pack up Rex.
Yeah.
To flee. I don't know. So there isn't. Again, I don't have an argument to bring up, but just his, the synthesis or constant ask of just what. So then what now?
Yeah, I think somehow it's the strength of, like, of the book as an aesthetic object is kind of the only thing that can possibly imbue us with hope or energize us to continue in the wake of all of these awful failures. Like, because otherwise you would kind of, like, if it wasn't made into an aesthetic object, I think, like, then it, you know, like, it would just be like a lesson in demoralization. So, like, the fact, I mean, this is literally, I don't know if I believe this thought because I'm having it as I speak it, but the fact that it's synthesized into this like remarkable, unwieldy aesthetic object means, like, okay, like, there's a force here that we do need to, like, keep reactivating and to kind of actualize today. That's my thought.
Absolutely. I think that might be a good place for us to end. Yeah, fabulous. And maybe not a Q&A. What do you guys think?
People can ask questions.
Oh.
Do we do we mingle, or do we have to clear the
Yeah,
room?
we can
Let's do
mingle.
that.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you once again to you guys for coming. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to our readers. Huge thank you to Joel. Thank you to Charlotte Tis.
Yes.
And have a wonderful night. Oh yeah, thank me.
Okay.